had worked as an MTA employee for years, and the quiet solitude of the night shift had always been a welcome escape from the chaos of the daytime. But one night, that calm was disrupted by an experience that still lingers with me. It was a typical shift. The fluorescent lights cast a stark glow over the deserted platform, and the faint rumble of distant trains echoed through the tunnels. I was stationed in the control booth, watching the cameras and monitoring the station. My coworker, Dave, was on the opposite platform, making his rounds. As the clock passed midnight, I decided to stretch my legs and take a walk through the station. The air was cool and slightly damp, carrying a faint metallic scent mixed with concrete. I strolled along the platform, the sound of my footsteps reverberating off the tiled walls. As I neared the far end of the platform, a faint sound reached my ears, a whisper. I stopped, straining to hear more, but the noise was gone. Shaking my head, I dismissed it as my imagination and continued walking. But then, the whisper came again, louder and clearer this time. "Help me!" I froze, turning to shine my flashlight into the tunnel. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty tracks. My heart began to race, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Is someone there?" I called out, but there was no reply. I returned to the control booth, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. Dave was seated inside, his eyes fixed on the monitors. "Hey," I said, attempting to sound casual, "did you hear anything strange just now?" He looked up, puzzled. "Strange like what?" "I thought I heard someone whispering for help." Dave shrugged. "Probably just the wind. These tunnels can mess with your head at night." I nodded, but the unease lingered. Settling into my chair, I kept a close eye on the monitors. The station remained empty, the platform still. About an hour later, as I reviewed paperwork, something on the screen caught my attention. A figure stood at the far end of the platform, partially hidden in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. "Dave, come here," I called, my voice trembling. He joined me at the monitor, his expression turning serious. "Who is that?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "I have no idea. They don't look like a passenger." I grabbed the radio and called out, "Hey, you down there? The station's closed. You need to leave." The figure didn't respond or move. Dave and I exchanged uneasy glances. "I'll check it out," he said, grabbing his flashlight. On the monitor, I watched as Dave made his way down the platform, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. When he reached the spot where the figure had been, it was empty. He turned back toward the camera and shrugged. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. "Maybe it was just a shadow," I said, trying to convince myself. But the feeling of dread persisted. Whispers began to echo faintly again, growing louder as the hours dragged on. Shadows flickered in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Around 3 a.m., the whispers became clearer and more urgent. They seemed to emanate from the tunnels, bouncing off the station walls. I approached the platform's edge and shone my flashlight down the track. "Help me, please." The voice was closer now, almost behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but no one was there. Dave returned, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yeah," I whispered, my hands trembling. "We need to figure out what's going on." Together, we decided to investigate the tunnels. The deeper we ventured, the colder the air became. The whispers grew louder, filling the darkness with desperate pleas. As we rounded a corner, we saw it again, a figure standing on the track. This time we could see him clearly, a man with tattered clothes, his face contorted in pain. "Help me," he whispered, extending a hand toward us. We froze, paralyzed with fear. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and ghostly. "Who are you?" Dave demanded, his voice unsteady. The man didn't reply, stepping closer instead. A wave of dread washed over me as the air turned icy. We turned and ran, our footsteps echoing in the tunnel. The whispers pursued us, growing louder, more frantic. Bursting onto the platform, we bolted back to the control booth, slamming the door behind us. The whispers seemed to surround us now. On the monitors, the figure appeared again, closer, advancing toward the booth. "We have to get out of here," Dave said, his voice breaking. Grabbing my bag, I nodded. We fled the station, the whispers trailing us until we reached the street, where they suddenly stopped. We reported everything to our supervisor, who assured us it would be investigated. The next night, both Dave and I were reassigned to different stations. I never returned to High Street Station, but that night stayed with me, a haunting reminder of something inexplicable lurking in the dark. What was once a place of routine and comfort had transformed into a source of fear and uncertainty. There was something alluring about the freedom that came with train hopping, the wind rushing through your hair, the adrenaline of leaping onto a moving freight train, and the exhilarating sense of adventure with every journey. When I was younger, it was my escape from the dullness of everyday life. After years of leaving that pastime behind, I decided to revisit it, hoping to reignite the thrill I once felt. It was a balmy summer evening, the sky glowing with the warm hues of a setting sun as I made my way along the familiar tracks near my hometown. The air was alive with the symphony of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. These tracks had been my playground in the past, cutting through expansive farmland and dense forests, perfect for an adventure. I found a curve in the tracks where the trains slowed just enough to hop on. Waiting there, I strained my ears for the rumble of an oncoming train. About an hour later, the faint clanging of wheels on metal reached me. My pulse quickened as the train rounded the curve, its headlights piercing through the twilight. As it slowed, I jogged alongside and grabbed hold of a ladder, pulling myself aboard. The train soon picked up speed, and I climbed into an open boxcar, settling in for the ride. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world was shrouded in darkness. The cool night air refreshed me as I leaned against the side of the car, enjoying the steady rhythm of the train's wheels. It was peaceful, almost meditative. The stars above sparkled brilliantly, connecting me to the vastness of the universe. But as the night deepened, that calm began to waver. Strange noises started to interrupt the tranquility, faint, almost inaudible at first. I brushed them off as the groans and creaks of the old train. Yet, the sounds became more distinct, almost like whispers carried by the wind. I sat upright, my heartbeat quickening. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the endless night. Silence answered me, save for the rhythmic clatter of the train. Uneasy, I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around the boxcar, illuminating nothing but emptiness. Trying to dismiss the growing unease, I settled back down. But the whispers persisted, growing louder. Though I couldn't discern the words, the tone was chilling, malicious and unnerving. A cold dread crept over me as I realized I wasn't alone. I turned the flashlight toward the far end of the boxcar, and that's when I saw it, a figure crouching in the shadows. My breath hitched as I strained to make out any details, but the figure remained cloaked in darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond or move. It simply remained crouched, watching me. My thoughts raced. Was it another train hopper, a transient, or something far more sinister? The train roared on, the scenery outside blurring into obscurity. Keeping my flashlight trained on the figure, I froze, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to leap off the train and run, but fear held me in place. Then, the figure began to rise, slowly and deliberately. It stepped into the beam of my flashlight, revealing a gaunt, pallid face and hollow eyes. A wave of terror gripped me, and I stumbled backward, my back colliding with the side of the boxcar. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure offered no reply. It simply stared at me, its eyes empty and cold. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, edging toward the open side of the boxcar. When the figure stepped closer, I knew I had to act. Without thinking, I leaped from the train, tumbling down an embankment and landing hard. Pain jolted through my side, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I scrambled to my feet and glanced back at the train, now vanishing into the distance. The figure stood at the edge of the boxcar, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. I could feel its gaze burning into me. Fear propelling me, I turned and ran, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about a mile away. Collapsing onto a bench at the deserted train station, I gasped for breath, my mind racing. The figure's haunting stare was burned into my memory. I waited there until dawn, the first rays of sunlight offering some sense of safety. When I finally returned home, I recounted the ordeal to my girlfriend. She laughed, brushing it off as my imagination or a drifter trying to scare me. But I knew better. That figure, with its hollow eyes and chilling presence, was real. I never hopped another train. The thrill of the journey had been replaced by a deep-seated fear I couldn't shake. Even now, the distant sound of a train rumbling through the night sends a chill down my spine, and those whispers return, echoing endlessly in my mind. Growing up in a small town, there were always rumors about spirits, and the tale of the phantom train was one of the most famous. It was said that late at night, on the abandoned tracks that cut through the outskirts of town, you could hear the whistle of a ghostly train that had vanished many years ago. As a teenager, I never put much stock in such tales, but one night, curiosity got the better of me. It was a chilly autumn evening, and a group of friends and I were sitting around a campfire in the wood. We were roasting marshmallows, sharing stories, and attempting to spook one another with tales of spirits and creatures. The sky was clear, and the full moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. As the night wore on, someone brought up the story of the phantom train. We all laughed and dismissed it as foolishness, but the idea intrigued me. After all, the old tracks were just a short walk from our campsite. I suggested we go check it out, half joking, but to my surprise, everyone agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and headed into the woods, the beams cutting through the darkness. The air turned colder as we neared the tracks, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The tracks appeared rusted and overgrown with weeds, stretching into the gloom. We walked along the rails, laughing and trying to scare one another, but the fun atmosphere couldn't mask my growing unease. The further we went, the darker and more oppressive the night seemed to become. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After about 20 minutes of walking, we reached an old, crumbling bridge that spanned a narrow ravine. The wood creaked beneath our weight as we crossed, adding to the eerie atmosphere. On the other side, the tracks continued into a dense fog that had begun rolling in. As we moved further into the mist, the temperature dropped even more. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. One of my friends, Jacob, suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. We all listened, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of our own breathing. Then, faintly, we heard it, a distant whistle carried on the wind. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Probably just the wind," Luna said, trying to sound brave, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We continued walking, our steps now hesitant. The whistle came again, louder this time, and then we saw it. A faint light in the distance, like the headlamp of an old train, moving slowly through the fog, casting long shadows on the ground. We froze, watching in disbelief as the light grew closer. The outline of a train began to form, its wheels clattering softly on the tracks. The train looked old, its paint faded and peeling, its windows dark and empty. "Is this some kind of prank?" Tim asked, his voice shaking. "I don't think so," I replied, my eyes fixed on the approaching train. We should go, but none of us moved. We were rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the sight. The train drew nearer, its whistle now deafening. I could feel the vibrations in the ground as it passed by, and for a moment I thought I saw faces in the windows, pale, ghostly faces staring out at us. The train continued, vanishing into the fog. We stood there, too stunned to speak, until it disappeared from sight. The silence that followed was suffocating. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the fear rising inside me. "We need to get out of here," I said, finally breaking the silence. We turned to leave, but as we did, we heard something that made my blood run cold. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the direction the train had gone. I shone my flashlight into the fog, and my heart nearly stopped. A figure emerged from the mist, walking along the tracks. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his face pale and expressionless. He moved with a strange, unnatural gait, his eyes locked on us. We backed away, our flashlights shaking. "Who are you?" Jacob called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. He just kept walking toward us, his eyes never leaving ours. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, the others following close behind. We sprinted back across the bridge, it creaking ominously under our weight. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. We huddled around the fire, trying to make sense of what we had seen. The fog had lifted, and the night was still and quiet once more. "What the hell was that?" Luna asked, her voice cracking. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "But I'm not going back there." We decided to pack up and leave, the fear still fresh in our minds. As we walked back to our cars, I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see the figure following us. But there was nothing, just the dark silhouettes of the trees. 4 weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I had nightmares about the train and the conductor, waking up in a cold sweat with the sound of the whistle echoing in my ears. I tried to find out more about the phantom train, but all the stories were the same, vague legends and ghostly sightings. I never went back to those tracks. The memory of that night was enough to keep me away. My friends and I drifted apart. The shared terror of that experience was too much to bear. We never spoke about it again. Graffiti had always been my passion. There was something thrilling about sneaking into places where I wasn't supposed to be, armed only with my spray cans and creativity. Train yards, with their rusty cars and endless walls, were my favorite canvases. That night started like any other. I slipped into the old train yard, the one near the abandoned factory at the edge of town. It was quiet, almost eerily quiet, but that's how I preferred it. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the scene. I walked along the tracks, my backpack clinking with the sound of spray cans. The train yard was a maze of old cars and overgrown weed. The place had been abandoned for years, and it felt like a world frozen in time. I found my spot, a rusted boxcar that had once been bright red but now looked like a faded, chipped relic of its former self. I pulled out my cans, shaking them to hear the familiar rattle, then began spraying. The sound echoed through the empty yard, the hiss of paint meeting metal almost soothing. I was in my zone, lost in my art, when I heard the first strange noise. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves or the scurrying of a small animal. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear. The night was still, the only sounds being the distant hum of the highway and the occasional chirp of crickets. I brushed it off and kept painting, but the noise came again, louder this time. It was unmistakably the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart rate quickened. I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. I crouched behind the boxcar, listening intently. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. I peeked around the corner, expecting to see a security guard or maybe another graffiti artist, but there was no one. I waited, barely breathing, until the footsteps stopped. Cautiously, I turned my flashlight back on and resumed my work, trying to shake off the unease. I had just finished a large piece when I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the night sounds, but it was there. "Leave." I spun around, shining my flashlight in all directions. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty tracks and abandoned cars. There was no one there. My pulse raced, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The wind could play tricks on you in a place like this. I packed up my gear, deciding it was time to leave. As I walked back toward the entrance, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving swiftly between two train cars. I stopped and shined my flashlight in the direction of the movement. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I kept walking, faster this time, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. When I reached the gate, I found it closed. I distinctly remembered leaving it open. Panic set in as I fumbled with the latch, finally managing to pry it open and slip through. I was almost at my car when I heard the footsteps again, this time running. I broke into a sprint, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were right behind me, gaining on me. I didn't dare look back. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. Breathless, I looked through the windshield and saw a figure standing at the edge of the train yard. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. The figure stood motionless, as if daring me to come back. I started the car and floored it, speeding away as fast as I could. My mind was racing with questions. Who was that? What did they want? I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still standing there, but the road behind me was empty. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the house made my heart race. The next day, I told a friend about what had happened. He suggested we go back together during the day to check it out. Reluctantly, I agreed. We arrived at the train yard in the early afternoon. The place looked different in the daylight, less intimidating, but the memory of the night before still sent chills down my spine. We walked through the yard, inspecting the area where I had been. My graffiti was still there, untouched. As we explored, we found something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt near the boxcar I had been painting, there were footprints. They led away from the spot where I had seen the figure, disappearing into the weeds. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We left the train yard, and I vowed never to return. But the nightmare didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, heard whispers when I was alone. One night, I woke up to find a message scrawled on my bedroom window, written in what looked like mud. "Leave." I moved out of my apartment, hoping to escape whatever was haunting me. The strange occurrences stopped, but the fear lingered. I never went back to that train yard, and I gave up graffiti altogether. The thrill of tagging wasn't worth the terror that followed. I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I learned that some places are best left alone. If these eerie train tales gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Have you ever had a train encounter that was more than just a nightmare? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Send this video to a friend, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.